I stood outside the small building on Maple Street, checking the address on my phone one more time. The faded sign above the door read, Parker's Pet Emporium, in peeling green letters, and I could already hear muffled sounds coming from inside. Scratching, chirping, and something that sounded like a low growl. My stomach twisted with nerves, but I needed this job too badly to turn around now. The bell above the door chimed as I pushed inside, and the smell hit me immediately. Not the typical pet store mix of sawdust and kibble, but something earthier, wilder, like a forest after rain, mixed with the metallic tang of old pennies. I blinked, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior, and immediately froze. The glass enclosures lining the walls didn't contain normal pets. In one tank, a creature the size of a guinea pig stood on 4 legs, but its neck stretched impossibly long, spotted like a giraffe. In another, what looked like a miniature elephant wandered around, covered in thick brown fur. I stared, convinced I was seeing things wrong, until the tiny elephant lifted its trunk and trumpeted. A sound so small it was almost cute. "You must be Emma." I turned toward the voice and found an older woman emerging from behind the counter. She had to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her movements were precise, practiced, like someone who'd been doing the same routine for decades. "Yes, ma'am, Emma Martinez. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Clara Parker, and you're welcome, dear. Though I should warn you, this isn't a typical pet shop position." She reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper, handwritten in careful script. "Before we go any further, you need to understand the rules. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're absolute requirements." I took the paper, noticing how her fingers lingered on it for a second longer than necessary, as if she was reluctant to let it go. The rules were numbered 1 through 5 in neat handwriting. 1. Be kind and polite to all customers regardless of their appearance or requests. 2. Do not ask questions about the merchandise, customers, or shop operations. 3. Never, under any circumstances, offer refunds or exchanges. 4. Do not touch, open, or look inside the covered fish tanks. 5. Feed the creatures every evening at closing time, but do not look at them directly while doing so. I read through the list twice, my confusion growing with each line. These are very specific. They need to be. Clara's tone was matter of fact, but there was an underlying seriousness that made me look up from the paper. "Emma, I'm going to be direct with you. This job pays well because it requires someone who can follow instructions exactly, without deviation, without question. Can you do that?" The desperation I'd been trying to hide must have shown on my face. My last 3 job interviews had ended with polite rejections, my savings account was nearly empty, and my landlord had already sent 1 late notice. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Good. Now let me show you around." She led me past the first row of enclosures, pointing out each one with casual efficiency. The miniature giraffe, she called it a pocket giraffe, munched on what looked like tiny acacia leaves. Next to it, a glass box housed what she referred to as woolly mammoths, though they were no bigger than hamsters, and their fur was a brilliant white that seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights. "These are our more standard offerings," Clara explained, moving toward the back of the shop. "Most customers prefer them because they're easier to care for." We passed tanks containing creatures I couldn't even begin to categorize. Something that looked like a cross between a lizard and a bird perched on a branch, its scales shifting color as we walked by. In another enclosure, a group of what appeared to be miniature horses grazed, except their manes flowed like water and caught the light in impossible ways. "What do they eat?" I asked, then immediately caught myself. "Sorry, rule number 2. Clara paused, giving me an approving nod. Very good. You're already learning. She continued walking, leading me toward the far wall where several large tanks sat covered with thick, dark cloth. A low humming sound came from beneath the fabric, almost too low to hear, but strong enough to feel in my chest. Those are the fish tanks mentioned in Rule 4, Clara said, not slowing down as we passed them. You'll dust around them during your daily cleaning, but that's all. I wanted to ask what kind of fish could make that sound, but I bit my tongue and followed her to the front counter. The register looked ancient but functional, with large buttons and a cash drawer that opened with a satisfying ding. Most transactions are straightforward, Clara said, running her hand along the counter's worn surface. Cash, credit cards, the usual, but some customers pay with alternative currency. She opened a drawer beneath the register, revealing compartments filled with what looked like very old coins, smooth river stones, and bundles of dried flowers tied with thin cord. Don't ask questions about any of it. Just accept whatever they offer and make change from the appropriate section. I stared at the drawer, trying to process the idea of making change in dried flowers. Clara closed it firmly and moved on to a filing cabinet behind the counter. Sales records go here, organized by date. Customer information is confidential. You don't discuss purchases with other customers. You don't mention names, and you certainly don't gossip about what anyone buys. She pulled out a thick ledger and flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting. Every transaction gets recorded, even the ones paid for with alternative currency. The scratching and chirping sounds had grown louder as more creatures became active, and I found myself glancing back at the enclosures. One of the covered tanks made a sound like gentle thunder, and I quickly looked away. It's nearly closing time, Clara said, checking an old-fashioned watch on her wrist. You need to see the evening routine. She moved to a storage closet and pulled out a large plastic container filled with various types of food. Some recognizable pellets and seeds, others that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Small cubes that glowed faintly blue, dried strips of something that might have been meat, and what appeared to be tiny crystal formations. Each enclosure gets fed according to the chart posted by the closet, Clara explained, pointing to a laminated sheet with detailed instructions. The portions are exact. Don't add extra, don't substitute ingredients, and remember Rule 5. She demonstrated with the first few enclosures, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the floor as she opened each one and dropped the appropriate food inside. Her movements were quick and efficient, but I noticed how carefully she avoided looking up, even when the creatures inside made excited noises at feeding time. The key is to never make eye contact, Clara said, moving to the pocket giraffe's enclosure. Keep your head down, drop the food, close the door, move on. Some of them will try to get your attention. Ignore it completely. I watched as she fed the woolly mammoths, who trumpeted enthusiastically but received no acknowledgement from Clara. When she reached the covered tanks, she lifted the cloth just enough to slide food underneath, never revealing what was inside. "Your turn," she said, handing me the container. My hand shook slightly as I approached the first enclosure. The creature inside, something that looked like a ferret with iridescent scales, watched me intently as I fumbled with the latch. I forced myself to look down at the floor and dropped in the required portion of blue cubes, then quickly closed the door. "Better," Clara said, "but faster. You don't want to give them time to react." I moved to the next enclosure, keeping my eyes down and trying to ignore the way the creatures seemed to move differently when I wasn't looking directly at them. By the time I finished the visible animals, my nerves had calmed somewhat. The routine was strange but manageable. Then Clara handed me a portion of what looked like raw meat and pointed toward the covered tanks. Same process. Lift the cloth just enough to drop the food in, then cover it immediately. The humming grew louder as I approached the first tank. I lifted the edge of the cloth, saw nothing but darkness inside, and quickly dropped the meat through the opening. Something splashed, and the humming changed pitch for a moment before returning to its original tone. The second tank was silent when I approached it, but as soon as I lifted the cloth, something moved in the water with enough force to make waves. I dropped the food and pulled the cloth back down, my heart racing. "Good," Clara said when I finished the last one. "You'll get faster with practice." She helped me put away the feeding supplies and walked me through the closing checklist. Lights off, register locked, doors secured. The creatures settled into quieter evening sounds as the shop grew darker, though the covered tanks continued their low humming. "Emma," Clara said as we reached the front door. She turned to face me, her expression more serious than it had been all day. "I need you to understand something. These rules aren't arbitrary restrictions or old-fashioned quirks. They exist for very specific reasons, and your safety, possibly your life, depends on following them exactly." I looked back at the darkened shop where shapes moved in the glass enclosures, and the covered tanks hummed their mysterious song. "What happens if I break one?" Clara's face grew grim. "That depends on which rule you break and how badly. But I can promise you this. No matter how harmless it might seem, no matter how reasonable the request or how small the exception, breaking any of these rules will have consequences you can't imagine." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. "Tomorrow you'll start meeting our customers. Some of them will test you either intentionally or by accident. Remember that your safety depends entirely on following the rules without exception, no matter how harmless breaking them might seem." I fumbled with the keys outside Parker's Pet Emporium, my hands still shaking slightly from the coffee I'd downed on the walk over. Clara had left me a note under the door with detailed opening instructions, but actually doing it alone felt different than watching her demonstrate yesterday. The lock turned with a satisfying click, and I pushed the door open to the familiar mix of earthy scents and that strange metallic tang. The creatures were already active, their morning sounds creating a symphony of chirps, scratches, and low rumbles. I flicked on the lights and checked my watch, 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes to get everything ready before the first customer arrived. I went through Clara's checklist methodically. Register turned on, lights adjusted to the proper dim setting, and a quick walk around the enclosures to make sure nothing looked obviously wrong. The pocket giraffe stretched its impossibly long neck and watched me pass while the woolly mammoths huddled together in their corner, their shimmering fur catching the light. I kept my distance from the covered tanks, though their low humming seemed louder this morning. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bell chimed. "Good morning." The man who entered moved with purpose, heading straight for a display case near the back wall that I hadn't paid much attention to yesterday. He was probably in his mid-40s, wearing a plain gray jacket and carrying a worn leather bag. Everything about him suggested routine. The way he walked, the practiced nod he gave me, even how he pulled out his wallet before reaching the counter. I watched him select a large paper bag from the case, the kind you might use for groceries, except this one had "Large Bones, Weekly Supply" written on it in Clara's neat handwriting. The bag looked heavy when he lifted it, and I caught a glimpse of white shapes inside before he closed the top. "That'll be $35, I said, checking the price list Clara had left by the register. He handed me exact change without speaking, tucked the bag under his arm, and headed for the door. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes. "Have a good day," I called after him, but he was already gone. I wrote the sale in Clara's ledger, noting the time and customer description like she'd shown me. James Wilson. I found his name on a customer list Clara had left, with a note that he came every Tuesday at 9 sharp. The efficiency of it all was almost comforting after yesterday's strangeness. The morning passed quietly after that. I dusted around the enclosures, careful not to disturb the covered tanks, and reorganized some of the supplies Clara kept behind the counter. A few people peered through the windows but didn't come in, probably deterred by the unusual sounds coming from inside. Around 10:30, the bell chimed again. "Oh, hello there. You must be the new girl Clara mentioned." The woman who entered looked to be in her late 30s, with short brown hair and the kind of patient expression you see on kindergarten teachers. She moved slowly through the shop, stopping at each enclosure to examine the creatures inside with genuine interest. "Yes, I'm Emma. Can I help you find anything?" "Just browsing for now, dear. Take your time." She spent nearly 20 minutes walking around, occasionally making soft, cooing sounds at the animals. I tried to look busy organizing receipts while keeping an eye on her, mainly because some of the creatures seemed more active when she was nearby. The pocket giraffe kept craning its neck to follow her movements, and something in one of the covered tanks made a sound like wind chimes. Finally, she approached the section where Clara kept what she called traditional pets, though even these looked unusual compared to normal cats and dogs. The woman knelt in front of a large enclosure housing several black kittens, all of them identical except for small differences in size. "This little one," she said, pointing to the smallest kitten. "He's perfect." I opened the enclosure and carefully lifted out the kitten she'd indicated. It was surprisingly calm, settling into her arms without protest. She held it close to her chest and smiled. "His name is Fluffy, aren't you, Fluffy?" The kitten purred, a sound much louder than seemed possible for something so small. I rang up the sale, $45, which seemed reasonable for a kitten, and she paid with a credit card. While I processed the payment, I glanced at the sales ledger and noticed an entry from last Tuesday. Catherine Roberts, 1 black kitten, $45. I looked up at the woman cuddling her new pet. The same name was printed on the credit card in my hand. Catherine Roberts had bought a kitten last week, too. The urge to ask about it was strong. Had something happened to the first one? Was she collecting them? But Clara's second rule echoed in my mind. No questions about customers or their purchases. I completed the transaction in silence, printed her receipt, and handed over a small carrier for the kitten. "Thank you so much, dear. Fluffy and I are going to be very happy together." She left with the same patient smile she'd worn when she entered, the carrier swinging gently from her hand. I wrote the sale in the ledger and tried not to think about what might have happened to the first Fluffy. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, each one stranger than the last. A teenager with purple hair bought 3 glass jars from a refrigerated case, each one containing what looked like tiny glowing insects that zipped around inside like fireflies. She paid with a $20 bill that felt oddly cold to the touch and left humming to herself. An elderly woman shuffled in around 2 o'clock and spent several minutes examining a display case I hadn't noticed before. It contained various feathers arranged on black velvet, some ordinary looking, others that seemed to shift color when the light hit them. She selected a single golden feather from a section marked Phoenix Down and paid for it with 5 crisp $10 bills, handling the feather like it was made of glass. The strangest transaction came just before closing time. A businessman in an expensive suit entered and went straight to a shelf behind the counter that held dozens of small vials filled with different materials: sand, colored water, what looked like crushed leaves, and other substances I couldn't identify. He pointed to a vial containing ordinary-looking sand and waited while I checked the price tag. $50, I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. He handed me the money without question, tucked the vial into his briefcase, and left with a brief nod. I stared at the $50 bills for a moment before adding them to the register. Sand. $50 for what couldn't have been more than a few tablespoons of sand. Each transaction felt normal in the moment. Polite customers, standard payment methods, nothing obviously dangerous. But the cumulative effect left me feeling unsettled. I wanted to ask Clara about the repeat kitten purchases, about why sand cost $50, about what those glowing insects actually were. But every time the questions formed in my mind, I remembered her serious expression when she'd explained the rules. No questions about merchandise, customers, or shop operations. As closing time approached, I began to dread the evening feeding. Yesterday, Clara had guided me through it, her calm presence making the strange routine feel manageable. Tonight I was on my own with creatures that made disturbing sounds and covered tanks that hummed with unknown contents. I pulled out the feeding supplies and checked the chart Clara had posted by the storage closet. Each creature had specific requirements: portion sizes, food types, timing. The instructions were detailed enough that I couldn't make mistakes, but that also meant there was no room for shortcuts. I started with the familiar animals, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor as I opened each enclosure. The pocket giraffe made a soft chuffing sound when I dropped in its portion of tiny leaves, but I didn't look up. The woolly mammoths trumpeted excitedly as their food hit the floor of their enclosure, their small feet pattering as they rushed toward it. Some of the creatures made sounds I hadn't heard during yesterday's feeding. Something that looked like a cross between a ferret and a lizard hissed when I approached its tank, and I caught a glimpse of movement much faster than seemed natural. I dropped its food, small chunks of something that glowed faintly blue, and quickly closed the latch. Another enclosure housed what Clara had called shadow cats, though they looked nothing like normal cats. They were completely black, as if cut from darkness itself, and they moved in ways that made my eyes hurt to track. When I opened their tank, they made a sound like static electricity, and the air around the enclosure felt suddenly cold. I kept my head down, dropped their food, dried strips of something dark red, and moved on quickly. The covered tanks were the worst part. As I approached the first one, the humming grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. I lifted the edge of the thick cloth just enough to drop in the required portion of raw meat, but something in the water moved with enough force to splash against the glass. The sound was wrong somehow, more like thick liquid than water. The second tank was silent until I touched the cloth. Then something inside moved quickly, creating waves that sloshed against the sides. I dropped the food through the gap and covered it again, my hands shaking slightly. The third and final covered tank made no sound at all, but when I lifted the cloth, the air that escaped smelled like ozone and burnt metal. I dropped the food, more of the glowing blue chunks, and heard it hit something solid rather than water. Whatever was in there wasn't swimming. I finished the feeding routine as quickly as possible, stored the supplies, and went through Clara's closing checklist. Lock the register, turn off most of the lights, check that all enclosures were properly sealed. The creatures settled into quieter evening sounds as the shop grew darker, though the covered tanks continued their low humming. At the front door, I paused to look back at the darkened shop. Shapes moved in the glass enclosures, and the covered tanks maintained their mysterious chorus. I'd made it through my first day alone without breaking any rules, handled transactions that defied explanation, and fed creatures that probably shouldn't exist. I turned the lock and headed home, feeling both accomplished and deeply unsettled. Tomorrow would bring more strange customers, more inexplicable purchases, and more questions I couldn't ask. But I'd proven to myself that I could follow Clara's rules, no matter how bizarre the situation became. That had to be enough. 2 weeks had passed since my first solo day, and the rhythm of the shop had become almost normal. I could navigate the morning opening routine without checking Clara's notes, handle the stranger customers with practiced politeness, and complete the evening feeding without my hands shaking. The pocket giraffe no longer startled me when it stretched its neck, and I'd learned to recognize the sound each covered tank made during feeding time. I was eating lunch behind the counter, picking at a sandwich while watching the woolly mammoths play in their enclosure, when the bell chimed earlier than usual. Clara walked in, her silver hair slightly disheveled and her expression more serious than I'd seen since my first day. "How are things going, Emma?" "Good," I said, setting down my sandwich. James came by for his weekly bones this morning, and Catherine bought another black kitten around 10:30. Same routine as always. Clara nodded, but her eyes moved around the shop with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was checking for problems. She walked to the covered tanks, pausing at each one to listen to their humming sounds. Whatever she heard seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "I've been wondering about those tanks, and some of the customers pay with such unusual things. I mean, yesterday someone bought a vial of sand for $50, and last week, Emma." Clara's voice cut through my words like a blade. She turned to face me, and the warmth that usually softened her features had disappeared completely. "What's the second rule?" My stomach dropped. "Don't ask questions about merchandise, customers, or shop operations." "That's right." She walked back to the counter, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I thought you understood why these rules exist." "I do understand. I just thought maybe after 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, you should understand better than ever." Clara placed both hands flat on the counter and leaned forward. "Curiosity might be harmless in most places, Emma, but not here. Not in this shop. Questions can be dangerous when you don't know what the answers might cost." I looked down at my half-eaten sandwich, feeling like a child being scolded. The creatures around us seemed quieter suddenly, as if they were listening to the conversation. "Some knowledge comes with a price," Clara continued, her voice gentler but still firm. "And some questions, once asked, can't be unasked. You've been doing so well following the rules. Don't let curiosity undo all that good work." She straightened up and checked her watch. "I need to run some errands, but I'll be back before closing. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing, and remember, the rules exist for specific reasons," I finished. "Exactly." Clara's expression softened just enough to show she wasn't angry, just concerned. "I'll see you later." After she left, I finished my lunch in silence, her words echoing in my mind. The shop felt different somehow, as if Clara's warning had reminded the creatures that I was still new, still learning. The pocket giraffe watched me with what seemed like increased interest, and one of the covered tanks hummed with a different pitch than usual. The afternoon passed quietly until around 3 o'clock, when the bell chimed with more force than usual. The man who entered moved like he was looking for a fight, his face set in hard lines and his hands clenched at his sides. He wore a dark jacket over jeans, and everything about his posture suggested barely controlled anger. He marched straight to the counter and slammed a small cage down hard enough to rattle the register. Inside was a hamster, clearly dead, lying on its side with its tiny legs stiff. "I want my money back." I looked at the cage, then up at his face. His eyes were cold and demanding, fixed on me with the kind intensity that made me want to step backward. But I stayed where I was and kept my voice level. "I'm sorry for your loss, but we don't offer refunds or exchanges." "That's ridiculous." He gestured at the dead hamster. "This thing died less than 6 hours after I bought it. You sold me a defective product." I pointed to the large sign posted by the register, the one Clara had positioned so every customer could see it clearly. "Our no refund policy is posted right there. All sales are final." His face darkened. "I don't care what your sign says. This is unreasonable, and you know it. I paid $40 for a pet that died immediately." "I understand you're upset," I said, falling back on the customer service training from my previous jobs. "But the policy applies to all sales regardless of circumstances." "Look, kid." He leaned across the counter, bringing his face closer to mine. "I'm not leaving here without my money. You can make this easy or you can make this difficult, but either way, I'm getting what I paid for." The creatures around us had gone completely silent. Even the covered tanks stopped humming. The absence of sound made his words seem louder, more threatening. I thought about Clara's warnings, about Rule 3, about the consequences she'd mentioned for breaking any of the shop's policies. "Sir, I cannot process a refund. The policy is absolute." "Absolute?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're being unreasonable. I could call the police about this, report you for fraud. A business that sells dying animals to customers." My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice steady. You're welcome to do whatever you feel is necessary, but I cannot and will not process a refund." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wanted to spit out. Around us, the shop remained unnaturally quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath. "Fine," he said, finally. "You want to play hardball? We'll play hardball." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter deliberately, pressing it flat with his palm before sliding it toward me. "You'll regret this decision," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Your choice has consequences you cannot imagine." He picked up the cage with the dead hamster and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back. "Tonight," he said. "Remember that." The door slammed shut behind him, and immediately the shop erupted back into normal sounds. Creatures chirped and scratched, the covered tanks resumed their humming, and the oppressive silence lifted like a weight being removed from my chest. I stared at the folded paper for several seconds before opening it. Inside, written in red ink that looked darker than normal pen, was a message in neat handwriting. "You will regret this decision tonight. Your choice has consequences you cannot imagine." My hands started shaking. I read the message 3 times, each word seeming to grow more ominous. This wasn't just an angry customer complaint. This felt like a threat, specific and personal. I grabbed the phone and dialed Clara's number, my fingers stumbling over the buttons. "Emma? What's wrong?" "A customer just left a threatening note," I said, the words tumbling out quickly. "He wanted a refund for a dead hamster, and when I said no, he got aggressive and left this message about tonight and consequences." The line was quiet for a moment. When Clara spoke again, her voice was sharp and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. Lock up the shop right now. Don't wait until closing time. Don't finish any tasks. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and go straight home. Lock all your doors and windows. Don't answer the door for anyone tonight, and don't leave your apartment for any reason." "Clara, what's going on? Who is that guy?" "Emma, just do what I'm telling you. Go home now and stay there. I'll explain everything tomorrow. But tonight you need to follow my instructions exactly." I fumbled with my apartment keys, Clara's urgent words still ringing in my ears. The hallway outside my door felt too quiet, too empty, as if the building had been abandoned while I was at work. My hands shook as I turned the locks, both of them, and slid the security chain into place. The threatening note was still in my jacket pocket. The red ink words burned into my memory. Tonight. Remember that. What did that even mean? Clara's reaction had been so immediate, so intense, that I couldn't shake the feeling I'd walked into something much bigger than an angry customer wanting his money back. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and checked every window in my small apartment. Living on the 2nd floor usually made me feel secure, but tonight the fire escape outside my living room window looked like an invitation for trouble. I pulled the curtains shut and double-checked the window locks. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door. Call me if anything happens." I heated up leftover pasta and tried to distract myself with television, but every sound from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps on the stairs, doors closing, the elevator creaking. Normal apartment building noises that suddenly felt loaded with potential danger. The threatening customer's face kept flashing in my mind, the way his eyes had gone cold when I refused to process his refund. Around 8 o'clock, I was washing dishes when something hit my living room window. Not a gentle tap or the sound of a bird flying into glass. A deliberate, heavy impact that rattled the entire frame and made the curtains shake. I froze with my hands still in the soapy water, listening to see if it would happen again. Silence. Then came the sound of glass cracking, slow and deliberate, like someone was applying steady pressure from outside. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drying rack and crept toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The curtains moved slightly, pushed by air coming through what must be a growing crack in the window. I could hear breathing from outside, heavy, labored, like someone who had climbed up the fire escape quickly. The glass exploded inward. I threw my arm up to shield my face as shards scattered across the living room floor. Through the jagged opening came a leg, then a torso, then the unmistakable figure of the angry customer from this afternoon. But something was wrong with him. His skin had a grayish tint, mottled and uneven, like old leather. When he straightened up and looked at me, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like staring into empty holes. He moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if something else was learning to operate his body. "You should have given me the refund," he said, but his voice had changed. It was still recognizably his, but layered with something else underneath, like two people speaking in unison. "Now the price is much higher." Behind him, through the broken window, came shapes that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. They moved like animals, but had too many joints in their limbs, bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. Their skin was dark and wet-looking, covered with what might have been fur, or might have been something else entirely. When they opened their mouths, rows of needle-sharp teeth caught the apartment's light. I backed toward the kitchen, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles went white. The creatures spread out across my living room with predatory patience, making soft clicking sounds as their claws scratched against the hardwood floor. "The rules weren't arbitrary," the thing wearing Richard's face said, stepping carefully over the broken glass. "They were protection. You chose to follow them, and now you get to experience what happens to those who refuse us." One of the creatures lunged. I swung the knife wildly, catching it across what might have been a shoulder. Black liquid sprayed across my arm, burning like acid where it touched my skin. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal being torn in half, and swiped at me with claws that were definitely not natural. Pain tore across my forearm as the claws raked through my sweater and into flesh. Blood soaked through the fabric immediately, and I stumbled backward into the kitchen counter. Another creature circled around my left side, while the first one pressed forward, both of them making that horrible clicking sound. I slashed at the second one and managed to drive it back, but the effort left me off balance. The first creature's claws found my face, opening 3 parallel cuts from my temple to my jaw. Blood ran into my left eye, making it hard to see clearly. Richard, or whatever was controlling him, watched from near the broken window with those terrible black eyes. He didn't participate in the attack, just observed with the kind of clinical interest a researcher might show while watching lab animals. "This is what refusal costs," he said in that doubled voice. "This is what happens when you choose rules over compromise." I backed against the refrigerator, waving the knife in front of me as both creatures advanced. My arm throbbed where the claws had torn through muscle, and blood from my face kept dripping onto my shirt. The creatures moved with increasing confidence, as if they could smell my weakness. Just as I felt my legs starting to give out from blood loss, my front door exploded inward. Clara burst through the splintered wood carrying a cloth bag, her silver hair flying behind her, and her face set in grim determination. She reached into the bag and threw handfuls of what looked like silver powder at the nearest creature. The effect was immediate and devastating. Where the powder touched the creature's skin, it began to smoke and dissolve, like salt on a slug, but much faster. The creature's shriek rose to an almost unbearable pitch before it collapsed into a pool of black liquid that continued to bubble and steam. She threw more powder at the second creature, which tried to flee toward the broken window. The silver dust caught it halfway across the room, and it dissolved just as completely as the first one, leaving only a dark stain on my hardwood floor. Richard collapsed. His body hit the ground with the solid thump of dead weight, and when I looked at his face, his eyes had returned to normal. Normal, but completely lifeless. Whatever had been controlling him was gone, leaving behind just a corpse that looked exactly like the angry customer who had demanded a refund 6 hours ago. Clara knelt beside me, her hands moving quickly over my injuries with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd done this before. She examined the claw marks on my arm, the cuts on my face, checking for depth and damage. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice calm despite everything that had just happened. "Refusing the refund was exactly what you should have done. If you had given it to him, you would have bound yourself to something much worse than this." I stared at Richard's body, then at the dark stains where the creatures had dissolved. My living room looked like a war zone, with broken glass, blood, and furniture overturned during the fight. What were those things? Clara helped me sit up straighter, still checking my wounds. Consequences. The kind that follow people who break the rules or try to force others to break them. She looked at the cuts on my face with concern. "These are deep, Emma. You're going to need medical attention. I can't go to a hospital like this. How would I explain any of it?" Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same serious tone I'd heard when she first explained the shop's rules. "I can heal these injuries completely. No scars, no lasting damage, no questions from doctors or insurance companies. But if I do, you'll have to trust me completely. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I looked at the blood soaking through my sweater, at the dark stains on my floor where impossible creatures had died, at the corpse of a man who had been possessed by something that defied explanation. Everything I thought I knew about the world had been shattered along with my living room window. But Clara had saved my life. She had known this would happen, had come prepared with silver powder and the knowledge of how to fight things that shouldn't exist. Whatever she was offering, whatever trust she was asking for, it couldn't be worse than bleeding out in my destroyed apartment. "Yes," I said, "I trust you completely." The words had barely left my mouth when doubt crashed over me like cold water. Trust her completely? I looked at Clara's weathered hands, at the silver powder still clinging to her fingers, at Richard's lifeless body sprawled across my living room floor. The pain in my arm pulsed with each heartbeat, and blood continued to drip from the cuts on my face onto my shirt. "Actually, I changed my mind," I said, pressing my back harder against the refrigerator. "I can handle this myself. I'll figure out what to tell the doctors." Clara's expression didn't change, but she stopped moving toward me. "Emma, look at your arm." I glanced down and immediately wished I hadn't. The sweater sleeve was completely soaked through with blood, and I could see white tissue through the deepest gash. My stomach lurched, and black spots started dancing at the edges of my vision. "You're losing too much blood," Clara said quietly. "You need help now, not after a trip to the emergency room and hours of questions you can't answer." The cuts on my face burned like someone was holding matches against my skin. Every time I blinked, blood got in my left eye, making everything look red and blurry. The adrenaline that had carried me through the fight was fading fast, leaving behind nothing but raw pain and the growing realization that I might actually be dying. "What exactly are you going to do?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. "Place my hand on your chest and channel healing energy through your body. You'll fall asleep, and when you wake up, the injuries will be gone." Clara spoke like she was describing how to make coffee, matter of fact and completely calm. No doctors, no questions, no scars. I looked at Richard's body again, at the dark stains where impossible creatures had dissolved into nothing. If Clara could fight things like that with silver powder, if she had known this attack was coming, maybe healing wasn't beyond her abilities either. "Will it hurt?" "No. You'll feel warm for a moment, then nothing." Another wave of dizziness hit me, stronger this time. I slid down the refrigerator until I was sitting on the kitchen floor, my injured arm cradled against my chest. The pain was getting worse instead of better, throbbing in rhythm with my pulse. "Okay," I whispered. Do it. Clara moved closer and knelt beside me on the blood-stained floor. She brushed broken glass out of the way with her foot, then placed her right hand flat against my chest, just below my collarbone. Her palm felt unnaturally warm, like she had been holding it near a fire. Close your eyes and try to relax. The warmth from her hand began to spread outward, flowing down my arms and up toward my face like warm honey in my veins. The burning pain from the cuts started to fade, replaced by a gentle, tingling sensation that reminded me of sitting in a hot bath after being outside in winter. My breathing slowed without me trying to control it. The warm feeling reached my fingertips and toes, then began moving deeper, like it was soaking into my bones. The last thing I remembered was Clara's hand on my chest and the sound of my own heartbeat getting slower and more distant. Everything went black. I woke up in my own bed with afternoon sunlight streaming through curtains I didn't remember closing. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to figure out why I felt so rested when the last thing I could recall was sitting on my kitchen floor, bleeding from claw marks. Then memory crashed back. The broken window, the creatures with too many joints, Richard's black eyes, Clara bursting through my door with silver powder. I sat up quickly and immediately looked at my left arm. The sweater was gone, replaced by a clean t-shirt, and when I pushed up the sleeve, I found smooth, unmarked skin. No cuts, no scars, not even the faint lines you'd expect from wounds that had barely begun to heal. I rushed to the bathroom mirror and examined my face. Nothing. The 3 parallel cuts that had run from my temple to my jaw were completely gone, as if they had never existed. My skin looked healthier than it had in months, actually, like I'd just returned from a long vacation. Good. You're awake. I spun around to find Clara sitting in the chair by my bedroom window, a cup of tea balanced on her knee. She looked exactly the same as always, silver hair neat and eyes alert, as if last night had been perfectly ordinary. How long was I asleep? 12 hours. It's Wednesday afternoon. Clara took a sip of her tea and gestured toward my dresser where a fresh cup waited. I made you some as well. You'll need the caffeine. I picked up the cup and sat on the edge of my bed, studying Clara's face for any sign that she found this situation unusual. She seemed completely at ease, like she'd spent the night in strangers' bedrooms many times before. My apartment, I said, remembering the broken glass and blood. Is it fixed? New window installed, floors cleaned, furniture replaced. Your landlord received a call about a gas leak that required emergency repairs while you stayed with family. Clara set down her cup and leaned forward slightly. No one will ask you any questions about last night. I walked to the living room and found everything exactly as Clara had said. New window, clean floors, my couch and coffee table looking like they'd never been disturbed. Even the air smelled normal, without any trace of the metallic tang that had filled the apartment during the attack. How is any of this possible? Clara joined me in the living room, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had important information to share. Sit down, Emma. There are things about the shop you need to understand. I settled onto the couch, wrapping my hands around the warm teacup. Clara remained standing, looking out the new window at the street below. Parker's Pet Emporium exists at the intersection of multiple realities, she began, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining fundamental facts about the world. The creatures you've been feeding, the customers who pay with unusual currency, the rules that seem arbitrary, all of it exists because our shop sits at a place where different worlds touch each other. She turned back to face me, her expression serious, but not unkind. The entities that possessed Richard last night, the creatures that attacked you, they come from places where chaos and rule-breaking have destroyed the barriers between realities. They feed on disorder, on the energy that gets released when someone violates the natural boundaries that keep different worlds separate. I thought about the customers I'd served over the past 2 weeks, James, with his weekly bone purchases, Catherine buying identical black kittens, the teenager with glowing insects, the businessman paying $50 for ordinary sand. So the customers. Some are normal people who've stumbled across something unusual and learned to accept it. Others are refugees from realities where the entities won. Clara sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap. The creatures in our shop, the ones you feed every evening, most of them are survivors. They escaped to our reality and found safety in a place where the rules still hold. The covered tanks suddenly made horrible sense. Whatever lived inside them, humming and splashing when I dropped food through the cloth, they were hiding from something worse than confinement. The rules protect them. The rules protect everyone. Customers, creatures, employees, and most importantly, they maintain the barriers that keep the destructive entities out. Clara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial filled with the same silver powder she'd used against the creatures. This shop has been operating safely for over 60 years because the rules have never been broken, not once. She set the vial on my coffee table, where it caught the afternoon light and sparkled like crushed stars. I've been the guardian for all 60 years, Emma. I was younger when I started, not much older than you are now. But I'm getting old, and this job requires someone trustworthy to take over when I can't do it anymore. I stared at the silver powder, understanding beginning to form in my mind like a picture slowly coming into focus. You want me to replace you. I want you to understand what you're already part of. Clara's voice was gentle but firm. You've proven you can follow the rules even when tested. You refused to give that refund even when threatened. That's exactly the kind of person this job requires. I set down my teacup and stood up, moving toward the window. The street below looked perfectly normal. Cars passing, people walking dogs. Ordinary Wednesday afternoon life continuing like nothing had changed. But I knew better now. I'd seen what existed just beneath the surface of normal. I want to quit. The words came out before I'd fully decided to say them, but once they were in the air, I knew they were true. I didn't want to spend my life feeding impossible creatures and serving customers who paid with strange currency. I didn't want to learn about multiple realities and destructive entities. I wanted a normal job with normal problems. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness I hadn't heard before. You can't quit, Emma. Not anymore. What do you mean I can't quit? The entities marked you last night. When Richard's possessors chose you as a target, when their creatures drew your blood, you became visible to them in a way you weren't before. Clara joined me at the window, looking out at the ordinary street. They know where you live now. They know who you are. And they'll keep coming after you until they either get what they want or you find protection somewhere they can't reach. My new understanding of the world tilted again, showing me another layer of impossibility I hadn't considered. What kind of protection? The shop, the rules, the barriers that keep them out. Clara turned to look at me directly. As long as you work there, as long as you follow the rules exactly, you're safe. The moment you leave, you become a target again. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the new window, thinking about the creatures that had torn through my apartment like it was made of paper. If more of them existed, if they could find me anywhere I went, then leaving the shop wasn't really an option at all. So I'm trapped. You're protected. There's a difference. Clara moved away from the window and picked up the vial of silver powder. Many people would consider what we do an honor. We're guardians of something important, protectors of refugees who have nowhere else to go. I thought about the pocket giraffe following customers with its curious eyes, about the woolly mammoths huddled together for warmth, about whatever lived in those covered tanks and needed to hide from direct sight. If they were refugees, if the shop was their sanctuary, then my job was more than just feeding strange animals and processing unusual sales. What happens if I break a rule, even accidentally? The barriers weaken, the entities get stronger, and everyone in the shop, customers, creatures, and employees, becomes vulnerable to attack. Clara placed the vial back in her pocket. That's why the rules exist, Emma. Not to control you, but to protect everyone who depends on them. I walked back to the couch and sat down heavily, the weight of everything I'd learned settling onto my shoulders like a physical burden. 2 weeks ago, my biggest worry had been paying rent on time. Now I was responsible for maintaining barriers between realities and protecting refugee creatures from entities that fed on chaos. I need time to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Clara stood up and moved toward my front door. But the shop opens at 9 tomorrow morning, and the creatures will need their evening feeding. Routine is important for their sense of safety. She paused with her hand on the doorknob and looked back at me. Emma, I know this feels overwhelming, but you've already proven you can handle it. You followed the rules when tested. You fought back when attacked, and you're still here asking good questions. That's exactly what this job requires. After she left, I spent the rest of the afternoon and evening researching everything I could find about interdimensional travel, reality intersections, and supernatural entities. Most of what I found was obviously fiction or obvious nonsense, but buried in forums and academic papers, I discovered enough references to thin places and boundary guardians to convince me that Clara wasn't the only person who knew about this kind of thing. I also researched Parker's Pet Emporium itself, looking for any history that might explain how it had become what it was. The records showed the building had housed various businesses for over a century, but every few decades it became a pet shop run by someone named Parker. Different first names, different people, but always a Parker, always selling unusual animals to selective customers. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me think creatures were climbing the fire escape again, and I found myself checking the window locks obsessively. But nothing happened. No attacks, no threatening notes, no possessed customers seeking revenge. Just a normal, quiet night in an apartment that showed no trace of yesterday's violence. Thursday morning, I arrived at the shop 15 minutes early, keys steady in my hands for the first time in weeks. I followed Clara's opening routine exactly, checking each enclosure and avoiding the covered tanks. But now, every step felt different. I wasn't just following arbitrary rules anymore. I was maintaining barriers that kept multiple realities from colliding. When Clara arrived at 8:30, I was behind the counter organizing the alternative currency drawer, making sure coins and stones and dried flowers were sorted properly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I understand why the rules matter." I closed the drawer and looked at her directly. Like I need to take this job more seriously than I ever took anything before. Clara nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude. And Emma, thank you for coming back. I know it wasn't really a choice, but you still made the decision to face this instead of running away. The morning passed quietly, with familiar customers following familiar routines. James arrived at exactly 9 for his weekly bones. Catherine bought another black kitten around 10:30, and several other regular customers purchased items that would have seemed impossible just 2 days ago, but now felt like normal business transactions. But I watched each customer more carefully now, looking for signs of possession or unusual behavior. I treated every rule like a life or death protection, because now I understood that's exactly what they were. And when the afternoon brought new customers I'd never seen before, I served them with polite efficiency while staying alert for any hint that they might test my resolve. The job hadn't gotten easier. If anything, knowing the truth made it more stressful, more important, more dangerous. But it also made it meaningful in a way few jobs could ever be. I wasn't just a shop clerk anymore. I was a guardian, a protector, a keeper of rules that literally held different realities apart. And when evening came and I began the feeding routine, dropping food into enclosures without making eye contact, I understood that every creature depending on me for safety was counting on my ability to follow those rules perfectly every single day, no matter what. No,